Do we have infinite or finite resources?
I guess that depends on how you look at it, but technically speaking, I would think that everything is finite. I mean, I don't see any logic just to the idea that you have any kind of infinite resource. I get the idea of renewable energy, if that's what someone is trying to broach, but like, because you can get a lot of energy from the sun, but eventually the fucking sun is going to blow up as well. That's not, I mean, that could be fine because we might not need it that long. We just use it and then we get something else and so on and so forth. And typically with energy, we go to different places. Obviously, we have finite resources. What I find interesting is the implications of that, and basically what that means for the entirety of society. I'd like to quote somebody that I'm a huge fan of, named Thomas Sowell. He said, quote, "The first lesson of economics is scarcity. There is never enough of anything to satisfy all of those who want it. The first lesson of politics is to disregard the first lesson of economics." End quote. I completely agree with that, and that's a lot of, like, when you ask that question, are resources finite or infinite? To me, it's like, well, of course they're finite, and because of that, a lot of shit naturally occurs, and I think people presume that they can, either they can ignore the fact that something is finite, or their implications for the finite resources are just wrong. And that's kind of what I think of when you bring the question to me, because the question, because if you just want a simple, is one or the other right answer, then the answer is, yeah, we have finite resources. But what I think is interesting about that is, like, just because they're finite doesn't mean that you're going to necessarily run out of them, or that they won't change hands or anything like that. Because, like, and this is me being like a free market guy, I think that, like, the type of market that we have, at least in the Western world, it's very capable of handing out resources to people based on, like, individual choices. And it's very difficult to, in a universe where you have finite resources, it's very difficult to ration those materials in a logical way that one individual would decide, as opposed to billions of individuals making individual choices in a market setting. Because if you have, like, in the Soviet Union, for instance, they had a lot of gluts. They had a lot of, because a general glut is what it's called when you have, it's a bunch of production, a bunch of supplied stuff that nobody is going to buy. Nobody wants to buy it. And they had that a lot in the Soviet Union. And the reason they had that is obviously because they were making direct allocation of funds to specific, like, what I would call demand-based necessities. They were entirely interested in, like, well, they need shoes. People need shoes. So we're going to make them shoes so they can walk, and they need to wear other clothes and stuff. But that's not really how that shit works. Really, it's like people just make things up, and then you go, oh, I want that. And that's kind of the basic version of supply side stuff. It's like, so in a universe in which resources are finite, there are certain, like, immutable laws to how you have to deal with the resources. So just one thing I want to bring up real quick is there was a famous bet between a couple of professors about basically whether or not a few metals would go up or down in price over a period of 10 years. And the reason this bet was at all interesting, the professors were Julian L. Simon and Paul Ehrlich. Oh, they weren't fucking professors. Fuck me. It was a business professor, one of them was Julian L. Simon, and a biologist. That's Paul Ehrlich. So they were arguing over population, which I don't think exists. And Ehrlich said it did, and Simon said it didn't. And so Simon said, okay, pick 5 things, pick 5 properties, metals or whatever. I think raw materials is what it was. And if you're correct, in 10 years, they should all be more expensive because we're running out of shit. And he said, oh, yeah, absolutely. So he picked copper, chromium, nickel, tin, and tungsten. In 10 years, they were all less expensive. So Simon won the bet. And people later on, they were like, well, if it had been in a different decade, because it was the Reagan Revolution. So I think I agree with that. If it had been in a different decade, it probably wouldn't have been as successful. It might not even worked at all. But one of the people who was critical of that said, even though he was critical, he said, but the long-term trend for metals, at least, is downwards. So I thought that was interesting. So yeah, I mean, like, just because we don't have infinite resources doesn't mean it's like a big problem. And people kind of act like eventually we're going to run out of this thing, and then there's going to be wars. Like, well, I mean, like, I kind of get the concept of water wars, but I have a feeling that there'll be an easier way to deal with that. And either through trade or through a red wedding-esque betrayal. I'm not saying that's what we're going to do, but just saying we're pretty good at it. I'm joking here, but like shit like that goes down, and oftentimes when shit like that goes down, it's easier than just having a war. But I don't know, like for me, the fact that we have infinite resources is just an excuse to go out there and be productive and figure out ways to find more resources. Humans can literally make up resources. And I don't want to get all pretentious, but I will for a second. I think of humans as obviously a resource, and one that is kind of infinite, because once we're out, I don't care. Like once we're all dead, it doesn't make a difference to us what happens. So we need to support ourselves. And an individual person could be like an Edison or some shit who changes everything. So yeah, that's basically my thought. Without any more interjection on your part, that's basically my general thoughts on that. I hope that wasn't confused and rambled.
Do we have infinite or finite resources?
That's a multi-layered question. I think that in the case of natural resources, we have a very finite amount of natural resources. But I think in the case of human ingenuity and our ability to adapt to our environment, our dependency on like solar, wind power, water, hydropower, just the fine tuning of that has gotten so expanded on that I feel like we can eventually have infinite or perpetual power from something, or we'll get to the point where we won't even need it anymore, where things are self-powering. And I think that the idea of that we have so finite resources that they cannot be shared is a pretty negative way of thinking, considering how much that we waste, and how many corporations that currently exist will throw away things like milk just to raise the prices of certain items. And I really feel like capitalism is beating like the hell out of us when it comes to how we allocate resources. Like we don't allocate resources properly. There are miles and miles of like empty open land across the United States that's barren because of like this crop farming, this monocrop farming, which doesn't actually produce enough food to feed everyone in the United States because we throw most of it away to build profits. And I feel like that's not a problem that our current administration really focuses on, because their ideas of corporations, what they grew up with, was that corporations were the American ideal. They were, basically using the resources properly. Like they were the mom and pop type of Americana that everybody could like depend on. Like you'd have high school kids work there, and they were just seen as kind of the good guys. And what's kind of interesting about our generation here is that we grew up during a time when they were ethically cracking down on corporations. They were cracking down on Marlboro. The biggest one they cracked down on would be like McDonald's, basically, talking about how it wasn't healthy for your body, but then also getting into how it was not ethically treating the animals either. So I think that we're at a good place to kind of change gears. And I think the mindset right now is really focused on health and creating like infinite resources, or retaining the resources we have right now to the point where we'll have them for the rest of our life, and whoever comes after us, that generation will have it. And really, if you think about it, the way that our planet is set up and the way that things naturally work, we have infinite resources. I mean, if you ever get into permaculture farming, the idea that the plants that grow first and then die become fertilizer for whatever grows there, or the idea of building a forest where each of the trees and plants inside of it work symbiotically together and create food for whatever animals are passing through long after human beings have passed away, like long after we're even there. So I think nature works it out to where we have infinite resources. And if we really, the biggest thing is just pulling away from fossil fuels. Like that's what's killing the infinite part of what our resources are, because they're poisoning the sky and they're poisoning the water, things that replenish themselves, like things that cycle. And I really think that should be our main focus right now. And I think that the older generation is so focused on past Americana, and just them growing up with the idea that this was the future and this is what's good and this is what's, historically led us to greatness is kind of what's killing us here with in terms of like where our resources are coming from or where they're being allocated. But yeah.
Do we have infinite or finite resources? We have finite resources. And here's the reason why. The GDP as of 2019 worldwide is around $80 trillion. That represents not only actual resources that we have, like the cost of gold, the cost of computers, the cost of every movie ever made, the cost of alcohol, everything. It also encompasses the cost of ideas, the cost of a book, the cost of, everything. Now, a counterpoint that might be made is that the GDP worldwide has been increasing over time. In 1960, it was about $1 trillion, or if you adjust it for inflation, it'd be about $15 trillion in today's money. And over time, that has increased roughly linearly to the roughly $80 trillion that it is today. And there's no signs of this trend slowing down. And that might be used as an argument that due to human ingenuity, we have infinite resources. My counterpoint to this is that even though it's increasing linearly, it doesn't mean it'll continue increasing indefinitely. There's an example in another field, specifically in computers, called Moore's Law, which was a theory that had been happening since the 1960s, that every 2 years, roughly, the amount of power used by a computer was halved and the amount of computational power it had would double. So it could do twice as many things for half the cost. However, as of this last decade, Moore's Law has no longer held up. Now, if you asked somebody 2 decades ago if we had infinite or finite computing resources, they could make the argument that we had infinite, because in the 90s, it seemed like that. It seemed like we had a trend that would go on forever. But we have now hit that limit where it is no longer keeping up in a linear fashion. As a matter of fact, it's starting to plateau. Likewise, with our resources, even though we have monetarily a linear increase over time, that doesn't mean that it'll continue indefinitely, and like the case with Moore's Law, there will come a day where we will hit a limit and it will plateau. Just because we haven't hit that limit yet, and just because we don't see that limit anytime in the near future, doesn't mean that one day we will come across it. And of course, this is all assuming that we're talking about resources only on Earth and not about resources that we'll get in space. Even with that being said, we are not in a scenario anytime soon even where we can even use resources that we get from outer space. So I'm not even counting that case. Anyways, that's all. So just realistically, based off of resources here on Earth, finite resources.